It is the morning of the 22nd of June 1941, and somewhere in the flat, scorched farmland east of Brest-Litovsk, a German panzer column is moving with terrifying confidence. The tanks roll in formation, their engines a deep mechanical thunder that seems to vibrate the very soil beneath them. For the soldiers watching from the tree line, British-trained, ill-equipped, desperate, there is a feeling that borders on helplessness. The armour ahead of them is not some abstraction from a briefing room map. It is real, and it is close, and it is coming. Now imagine you are one of those soldiers. You have no artillery. Your anti-tank rifle, if you even have one, requires you to place a round with almost surgical precision to have any hope of penetrating the vehicle's hide. Your grenades will bounce harmlessly off the glacis plate and detonate in the dirt. You're essentially being asked to stop a moving metal fortress with tools designed for a different kind of war entirely. The gap between what the enemy possesses and what you are holding in your hands is not merely tactical, it is existential. This is the problem that British weapons designers were staring at in the desperate, chaotic months of 1939 and 1940. And the solution they arrived at, crude, unglamorous, somewhat absurd, and utterly ingenious, was a glass flask wrapped in a woolen sock, coated in adhesive, and primed with a chemical fuse that activated on contact. It cost roughly 2 shillings to manufacture. It weighed just under a kilogram, and it was designed to be thrown by hand against the armour of an enemy tank, where it would stick fast and detonate in a flash of thermite and flame. It was called the Grenade Hand Anti-Tank Number 74. The world would come to know it simply as the sticky bomb. To understand why such a device was ever produced, why a nation that prided itself on engineering tradition resorted to something that looked more like a laboratory accident than a weapon of war, you need to understand just how severely British military planning had failed to anticipate the armoured threat that Germany was now deploying across Europe with shocking speed and discipline. Throughout the 1930s, British Army doctrine had not entirely dismissed the tank, but it had never fully reckoned with what happens when an enemy uses armour not as a support mechanism for infantry, but as the primary instrument of breakthrough and exploitation. The Blitzkrieg model, fast, concentrated, coordinated, caught Allied planners in a posture they were utterly unprepared to counter at the infantry level. Anti-tank guns existed certainly. The 2-pounder was a reasonable weapon in 1939, capable of penetrating the armour on most German tanks then in the field. But anti-tank guns are heavy, crew-dependent, difficult to conceal, and almost impossible to use in ambush conditions where a single tank might appear at 30 metres with no warning at all. What the British infantry soldier lacked in the early war years was a one-man, close-range, last-resort weapon that could defeat armour without requiring specialist training or a crew of 5. The boy's anti-tank rifle, chambered in .55 caliber, had been issued as one solution, but its penetrating power was marginal even against light armour, and its brutal recoil made it genuinely unpleasant to fire. Beyond a certain range, and against anything more heavily armoured than a half-track, it was essentially symbolic. The infantry needed something else, something a single frightened soldier could carry in one hand and use in the worst possible conditions, with minimal training, against a target that was trying very hard to kill him first. The difficulty was physics. To defeat tank armour, you need either a shaped charge, which focuses explosive energy into a narrow, penetrating jet, or a sufficiently large explosive mass in direct contact with the hull to transmit enough force to rupture the plate. Both approaches require the weapon to be stationary relative to the target at the moment of detonation, which is precisely the problem with throwing things at moving vehicles. A grenade that bounces, rolls, or slides off an angled glacis plate might detonate 2 meters away from where it was intended to land. dramatically reducing its effect. The challenge then was not just to make an explosive device powerful enough to damage a tank. The challenge was to make it stay there. The design team working on what would become the sticky bomb operated out of the newly formed Department of MD1, a small unconventional weapons research unit established in 1939 under the directorship of Major Millis Jeffries, a Royal Engineer officer with a reputation for lateral thinking and an almost complete indifference to orthodox procurement channels. Jeffries and his small team, based initially at a requisition property and later at the Firs in Whitchurch, Buckinghamshire, were given a mandate that was, by the standards of British bureaucracy, essentially unlimited. They were to develop weapons that the conventional supply chain could not or would not produce. They reported directly to Churchill's scientific advisor, Frederick Lindemann, which gave them a line to the very top of government that most weapons developers could only dream of. The sticky bomb concept was disarmingly simple. A spherical glass flask, roughly the size of a large grapefruit, approximately 15 centimeters in diameter, was filled with nitroglycerin-based explosive. The flask was then coated in a layer of powerful adhesive, derived from bird lime and synthetic compounds, which allowed it to adhere to smooth metal surfaces on contact. Over the adhesive layer went a woolen stockinette sock, which served two purposes. It protected the adhesive coating during handling and transport, and it kept the device from inadvertently sticking to the soldier carrying it. The whole assembly was mounted on a wooden handle, roughly 30 centimeters long, which gave the thrower some additional reach and control. The fuse mechanism was a 5-second chemical delay, activated by pressing a lever on the handle before the stockinette was removed. The sequence of use was, in theory, straightforward. Pull the pin to arm the device, remove the sock to expose the adhesive, approach the tank, press the flask firmly against the hull, and retreat before the 5-second delay expired. In practice, of course, none of this happened under anything resembling controlled conditions. It happened in mud, in darkness, in terror, within arm's reach of a vehicle that could crush a man flat in seconds. The 5 seconds, by all accounts, felt simultaneously like an eternity and no time at all. The explosive charge itself, approximately 560 grams of nitroglycerin, was sufficient to punch through the 15 millimeters of armour typical of German light tanks in 1940, or to disable the tracks and running gear of heavier vehicles. Against the early Panzer I and Panzer II, which carried between 7 and 14 millimeters of armour on their side and rear plates, a well-placed sticky bomb could prove decisive. Against the Panzer IV, with 30 millimeters of side armour, the outcome was less certain but far from negligible, particularly if the bomb was placed on a hatch, an engine cover, or the thinner armour at the rear. Production was organised through civilian manufacturers, many of whom had no prior connection to munitions work. The relatively simple components, glass flasks, wooden handles, basic chemical compounds, made the weapon well suited to dispersed manufacture. Estimates suggest that somewhere in the region of 2.5 million units were produced between 1940 and 1943, though exact figures for individual batches remain scattered across archival records. The cost per unit, consistently cited at around 2 shillings, made it one of the least expensive anti-armour weapons ever produced by any belligerent in the Second World War. Operational use of the sticky bomb is a subject where the historical record becomes considerably murkier. The weapon was issued primarily for Home Guard use. The volunteer civilian defence force established in 1940 to defend Britain against a potential German invasion, and the majority of sticky bombs produced never saw combat in the conventional sense. They were stockpiled in village halls, church crypts, and garden sheds across England, ready for an invasion that, ultimately, never came. For this reason, first-hand accounts of the weapon in actual use against enemy armour are sparse, and the documentary record reflects a device that spent most of its operational life in readiness rather than in action. There are accounts from training exercises that are themselves illuminating. The adhesive, it turned out, performed rather less reliably in cold or wet conditions than in the laboratory. Early versions of the stockinette were found to occasionally adhere too enthusiastically to the handler's uniform, with consequences that range from embarrassing to actively dangerous. One training report from the winter of 1940 noted, with the careful understatement characteristic of British military correspondence, that several soldiers had experienced difficulty separating themselves from the device prior to throwing it. Modifications were made. The adhesive formulation was revised. Instructions were updated to emphasize the importance of keeping the sock in place until the last possible moment. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The sticky bomb did see use in theatres beyond Britain itself. There are documented references to the weapon being supplied to resistance groups in occupied Europe, where its simplicity of operation made it well suited to personnel who could not receive formal training. Its use by Yugoslav partisans and certain French resistance cells has been recorded, though the precise operational record in these contexts is difficult to reconstruct with any confidence. What can be said is that the concept, an adhesive explosive attached to a vehicle by hand, was one that irregular fighters found genuinely practical, particularly for sabotage of parked or stationary vehicles rather than moving tanks in the field. The Germans, for their part, were aware of the device. After examples were captured or recovered, both from British prisoners and from Home Guard training areas, German Army intelligence produced assessments of its capabilities and limitations. Somewhat remarkably, the Wehrmacht appears to have developed a countermeasure that was both effective and, in retrospect, faintly comic. Tank crews began applying a coating of concrete, grease, or in some cases curved metal sheeting to the outer surfaces of their vehicles, with the express purpose of preventing adhesive devices from gaining purchase. The psychological effect of this countermeasure may be more significant than its practical one. The sticky bomb had, in effect, forced German engineers to rethink the external surface treatment of their armour. By comparison with German anti-tank solutions available to infantry at the same period, the sticky bomb presents an interesting study in contrasting philosophies. The German Haftvorladung, a magnetic-shaped charge mine that could be attached to tank armour, was in many respects a more sophisticated weapon. It used a properly engineered shaped charge capable of penetrating significantly more armour than the sticky bomb's simple blast effect, and its magnetic attachment was considerably more reliable than adhesive. However, it was also heavier, more expensive, more complex to manufacture, and required a slightly longer arming and placement procedure. The British weapon, for all its primitive appearance, got a soldier to the target and back, in theory, in under 10 seconds. In the context of the terrified, improvised, last-ditch defense scenarios for which it was designed, those seconds mattered. The American military, supplied with details of the sticky bomb through the exchange of technical intelligence common to Allied cooperation, declined to adopt it for regular issue. American infantry anti-tank philosophy in the early war years remained centered on the anti-tank gun, and later the bazooka, a rocket-propelled weapon introduced in 1942 that allowed the infantryman to engage armor from a considerably safer distance. The bazooka's adoption rendered close-range devices like the sticky bomb largely redundant in American doctrine, and by 1943, the British were themselves transitioning toward more sophisticated infantry anti-tank weapons, including the PIAT, the projector infantry anti-tank, which could be fired from cover rather than delivered by hand to the surface of a moving vehicle. The legacy of the sticky bomb is, in the conventional military historical sense, modest. It did not win any particular battle. It did not sink any notable ships or destroy any famous armoured formations. Its contribution to the actual course of the war in material terms was, by any honest reckoning, marginal. The invasion it was designed to repel never happened. The tanks it was built to destroy mostly fell to other weapons, other armies, and other methods. And yet, the sticky bomb represents something that is genuinely important in the history of British wartime ingenuity, and that is the willingness, under existential pressure, to abandon the comfortable assumptions of conventional procurement and ask a different kind of question entirely. Not, what is the best possible anti-tank weapon that we can develop over the next 5 years, but what can a single frightened man carry in one hand and use effectively against a tank in the next 30 seconds? It is a question that strips away every comfortable abstraction and forces an answer that is honest about human limitation, physical reality, and the brutal economy of emergency. Millis Jeffries and the team at MD1 produced dozens of similarly unorthodox weapons during the war years: the limpet mine, the clam charge, the beehive demolition device, and others. And the sticky bomb sits alongside them as evidence that the most effective innovations are sometimes the ones that look, on first inspection, like mistakes. The adhesive, the glass, the woolen sock. None of it sounds like a weapon. All of it was. Surviving examples of the sticky bomb are held in the collection of the Royal Armouries Museum at Leeds, as well as in the collection of the Imperial War Museum in London, where the device sits in its display case with a peculiar domesticity. Small, round, almost spherical, its handle unremarkable, its purpose quietly extraordinary. It looks like something you might find in a garden shed, which is, of course, precisely where most of them ended up, waiting for an enemy that never came, corroding gently through the decades in the company of rusting garden tools and forgotten paint tins. The German panzer columns rolled east in the summer of 1941, as confident and as terrible as anything in modern warfare had yet produced. They did not come west. They did not come across the English Channel to meet the men in the home fields and the village squares who were holding their glass flasks and their 5-second fuses and their absolute bone-deep determination to make those 5 seconds count. We will never know what would have happened if they had. We know what was ready. We know what 2 shillings could buy. It could buy a man a weapon. It could buy a nation a chance. And sometimes, in the terrible arithmetic of war, that is precisely enough.